I didn't know my life was about to split cleanly into before and after because of one email that read like a threat dressed up as a chore chart. It hit my phone while I was in the campus library. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, my backpack digging into my shoulder, my stomach dropping like I'd missed a step. Subject: cleaning rotation. From Mike. Message: if you don't plan on participating in the cleaning rotation, you'll need to pay both of us to make up for it. Pay them for not cleaning their mess. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, then snapped back into focus. Meaner, clearer. I was 23. I was barely even at that apartment. One, maybe 2 nights a week. Sometimes none. I didn't cook there. I didn't watch TV in the living room. I walked in, went straight to my bedroom, used my private bathroom, and slept like a commuter who paid rent. And somehow I was being told I owed money because their kitchen was dirty. My fingers tightened around my phone. My pulse thudded in my ears. I typed back, slow and careful, because I'd learned something about men like Mike. The moment you sound emotional, they use it like evidence. Me. I have been participating. I drive an hour to do the cleaning. Also, you can't require me to pay you for something that isn't in the lease. His reply came fast, like he'd been waiting to pounce. Mike. It's not our problem you're never here. You signed up for the rotation. Never here. As if my absence was a crime, and not the reason the apartment stayed quiet. I thought about the last time I'd walked into the kitchen. Flies hovering near the sink, a sour smell rising from 2-day-old dishes they insisted was normal. I remembered the dishwasher I had never used, that I'd driven an hour just to empty because Mike accused me of letting dishes pile up. My throat went tight, the kind of tight that warns you. You're either going to cry or you're going to fight. I stood up so abruptly my chair scraped the floor. Tonight was the house meeting. My boyfriend was coming with me, not to speak for me, not to intimidate anyone, but to be close enough that I didn't feel trapped in a home that suddenly didn't feel safe. Because I had a bad feeling about Mike, and I couldn't shake the sense that the dishes weren't the real issue at all. If you'd met me a year ago, you would have thought I was the kind of girl who always had a plan. I was the one with the color-coded calendar, the backup charger in my bag, the just-in-case granola bar. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't dramatic. I didn't crave conflict. But I also wasn't rich. I was a full-time college student trying to finish my degree without drowning my parents in financial guilt or drowning myself in loans. I commuted when I could, crashed at my parents' place an hour away when the week got heavy, and spent most of my time on campus because campus was the only place where I could exist without paying for every breath. That's why I took the room. The apartment was close enough that I could run from my last class to my bed without thinking about highways or gas money. The rent was reasonable, almost suspiciously so, and the setup sounded perfect on paper. My own bedroom, my own private bathroom, no fighting over shower time, no sharing sinks, no stepping on someone else's hair in the drain. The only catch was the roommates. 2 older men. Mike was 37. Loud energy, even when he wasn't speaking, like he entered rooms expecting them to adjust around him. George was 45, quieter, more contained. The type who folded his arms when he listened, like he was weighing your words for value. When I first toured the place, I tried not to let my nerves show. I'd grown up being taught to smile through discomfort, to be polite, to not make men feel accused simply because I wanted to feel safe. They acted normal enough that day. Mike joked about the joys of shared living, like we were all in the same stage of life. George asked me what I studied and nodded like he approved of the answer. They pointed out my room, the bathroom door that would be mine alone, the closet space, the window that faced the street. I asked the obvious questions. How do you guys usually handle bills? Is the neighborhood quiet? What are the house rules? And that's when they told me about the system like it was a selling point. A weekly cleaning rotation. One week you handle the kitchen and floors. Another week you dust. Something like that. I agreed without thinking too deeply, because at that moment I was thinking about distance to campus and whether I could afford groceries if I chose a different place. I wasn't picturing myself scrubbing their stovetop after they cooked. I wasn't picturing flies in the sink. I was picturing survival. And in the beginning, it truly didn't matter because I was barely home. My schedule was a blur of early mornings and late nights. Most weekdays I left around 7 a.m. and didn't return until 9 p.m., sometimes later. I ate on campus, grabbed takeout, studied at the library, and when I did come back to the apartment, I moved like a ghost, quiet, contained, straight to my room. Weekends, I usually stayed with my parents or at my boyfriend's place. My boyfriend, Ethan, was steady in the way I needed. Not controlling, not jealous, just present. A calm hand on my shoulder when my brain started sprinting. A voice that said, "You're not crazy," when I felt myself second-guessing what I was allowed to expect from people. The apartment was supposed to be a practical choice, not a social one. I didn't move in looking for friendship. I moved in looking for a door I could close and a bathroom I didn't have to share. At first, it worked. I didn't notice any drama because I wasn't there long enough to witness it. But then, about 4 months in, we had that house meeting about the cleaning rotation. Formal, almost ceremonial. And something shifted. Not in the apartment. In their expectations of me. And I didn't realize it yet, but that was the moment I stopped being the quiet roommate who's never home and became something else in Mike's mind. A target. The first thing I noticed wasn't anger. It was control. Control disguised as reminders. Control wrapped in house rules. Control hiding behind the word fair. It started with a text from Mike on a Tuesday morning. "Mike, hey, just a reminder that it's your week to clean the kitchen." The smiley face felt unnecessary, like someone knocking too loudly on a door that wasn't theirs. I stared at the message, confused. It was only Tuesday. The week had barely begun. I hadn't forgotten. I'd never forgotten. I always planned to do the cleaning on Thursdays or Fridays, on the rare days I was actually in town. So I replied calmly, "Me. Thanks. Is there a reason you're reminding me so early?" "Mike, just a friendly heads up." I let it go. The next day, the tone changed. "Mike, the kitchen is a mess because you didn't empty the dishwasher. My dishes are piling up." My chest tightened. I reread the message twice, then a third time, waiting for the part where it made sense. I had never used that dishwasher, not once, not a plate, not a fork. I didn't even know which button started it. Me. "I haven't used the dishwasher at all. I didn't realize emptying it was part of the rotation." His reply came back sharp. "Mike, kitchen duty includes everything in the kitchen. That's common sense." Common sense. The phrase people use when they don't want to explain themselves. I tried to reason with him. I explained that wiping counters and sweeping floors made sense as a weekly task, but emptying the dishwasher was time-sensitive. It needed to be done whenever it was full, not assigned to someone who wasn't even present. Mike didn't engage with the logic. He engaged with authority. "Mike, you agreed to the system. If you don't like it, that's your problem." I sat there in my car, parked outside the library, my hands resting on the steering wheel, like I needed something solid to keep me from floating away. I could have said no. I could have refused. Instead, I did what women are trained to do when we don't want conflict to escalate. I complied. I drove an hour to the apartment that night, walked into a kitchen that smelled faintly sour, opened a dishwasher full of their dishes, and emptied it alone. I didn't stay. I didn't even take my shoes off. I left immediately. The next day, I sent an email to both Mike and George, carefully written, polite to the point of exhaustion. I explained my reasoning. I explained my absence. I explained that emptying the dishwasher shouldn't fall under a weekly rotation when it was being filled daily by people who were actually there. I even offered a compromise. I would empty it if it was full when I did my general kitchen cleaning. Their response wasn't a discussion. It was a dismissal. They told me it didn't matter how often I was home. It didn't matter that I didn't use the kitchen. It didn't matter what seemed logical. What mattered was the rule, so I kept doing it. Week after week, I drove an hour just to clean messes I didn't make. I wiped counters I hadn't touched. I emptied a dishwasher that felt more like a symbol than an appliance. And that's when I started noticing things. The flies near the sink, the 2-day rule for washing dishes, the way Mike always spoke like the house was his, even though we were all on the lease. George stayed quieter during all of this, occasionally sympathetic, occasionally distant, never fully stepping in. And slowly something settled in my gut. This wasn't about cleaning. This was about power, about who could make whom bend. And when Mike sent that email demanding I pay them if I didn't comply, I finally understood something that scared me more than the mess ever had. He didn't see me as an equal roommate. He saw me as someone he could pressure, someone he could corner, someone he expected to give in. Tonight we were supposed to talk it out. But deep down I knew this meeting wasn't going to be about dishes. It was going to be about whether I'd finally say no. The house meeting was scheduled for 7. I arrived at 6:58, heart beating hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. My boyfriend Ethan came with me like we agreed. He didn't hover. He didn't posture. He just kissed my forehead softly and said, "I'll be in your room. Text me if you need me." Knowing he was there steadied me. We sat in the living room, me on one end of the couch, Mike and George across from me. The air felt thick, like a room where something had already gone wrong, and no one had acknowledged it yet. George spoke first. "I'm glad we're doing this in person," he said. "I hate resolving things over email." Mike didn't look at me. His jaw was tight, his arms crossed. He looked angry before anyone had even spoken. "I'll just say it," Mike cut in. "This whole situation exists because you don't pull your weight." There it was. No greeting, no build-up, just accusation. I opened my mouth to respond, but George interrupted him. "That's not fair," George said. "Let's not start by blaming." Mike shot him a look, then turned back to me. "You're never here," he said, "but you want all the benefits of living here without doing your part." I felt heat rush to my face, but my voice stayed steady. "I pay rent, I pay utilities, and I do clean. I just don't live here the way you do." "That's your choice," Mike snapped. "Doesn't change your obligations." George shifted in his seat. He started talking about communication, how it would be helpful if I let them know when I'd be gone for extended periods. He framed it as concern, as safety. "As a young woman living in the city," he said carefully, "it would be good for us to know when you're around." I almost laughed. I didn't. Instead, I nodded and said I'd inform them of my schedule for logistical reasons, even though something about it felt patronizing, like my independence was being reframed as irresponsibility. I redirected the conversation back to cleaning. I explained, again, how I drove specifically to clean, how absurd it felt, how unfair it was to be responsible for messes I didn't make. For a moment, George seemed to understand. "I get why that feels frustrating," he said. "We do all use the space differently." Mike stayed silent, staring at the floor. Then George did something I didn't expect. He turned to Mike. "While we're talking about fairness," George said, "you need to wipe down the counters better after you cook. We're getting ants." Mike's head snapped up. "What do you mean better?" he demanded. "I clean." George stood and walked into the kitchen. "I'll show you." We followed. George pointed out crumbs I hadn't noticed before. Small, but obvious once you were looking. Mike's face flushed. "Well, maybe if I didn't get yelled at for dishes sitting out. And maybe," George interrupted, "you shouldn't leave plates on the floor for your dog to lick." Mike spun on him. "That's not even—" They started bickering, voices overlapping, irritation spilling out sideways. It was like I'd stumbled into an argument that had been going on long before I ever moved in. Standing there, watching them snap at each other over crumbs and dogs and dishwashers, something clicked. I wasn't the problem. I was the buffer, the easiest person to blame. George then brought up the dishwasher, how it should only be run when full, how water conservation mattered to him. Mike threw his hands up. "So what do you want from me? I run it too much, I don't run it enough, nothing's ever good enough." That's when I spoke. "I think we're all doing the same thing," I said quietly, letting frustration build until it explodes. They both looked at me. "I've been anxious about this meeting for days," I continued, "and it feels like you two have been holding on to stuff too. Maybe the cleaning isn't the real issue." Mike scoffed. "I never said you weren't doing anything," he muttered. I pulled out my phone. "You said I wasn't participating," I replied, "in writing." He went still. "I didn't know you were driving just to clean," he said after a moment. "That's the problem," I said. "You assumed instead of asking." George suggested we all think about a new system. Then he proposed hiring a maid, splitting the cost. I immediately shut that down, pointing out I'd end up paying the most for cleaning I didn't benefit from. We ended the meeting unresolved. No agreement, no apology, just a tense truce. But as I walked back to my room, my hands shaking slightly, I realized something important. Mike's anger had nothing to do with me. I was just standing in the wrong place when it spilled over. And whatever was really going on between them. It wasn't over. I didn't sleep at the apartment that night. I stood in my room for a few minutes after the meeting ended, listening to the low murmur of their voices in the kitchen, the scrape of a chair, the clink of a glass against the counter. My hands were trembling, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough that I had to press my palms together to steady them. This was supposed to be simple. Rent, a door that locked, a place to sleep between classes. Instead, it felt like I was living inside someone else's unresolved anger. I packed a small bag and texted Ethan. "I'm heading out. Ethan, I'll walk you to your car." He didn't ask questions. He didn't tell me what I should have said or how I should have handled it. He just stood beside me in the hallway while I locked my door, his presence quiet and grounding. Once we were outside, the night air hit my face and my chest finally loosened enough for me to breathe properly. In the car, the silence stretched. "I'm not crazy, right?" I finally asked, staring straight ahead. "This is weird." Ethan didn't hesitate. "No," he said. This is control disguised as fairness. And Mike's anger? It's not about dishes. I knew that already. But hearing someone else say it made something settle inside me. That night at my parents' house, I lay awake replaying the meeting in fragments. Mike's crossed arms, George stepping in and out like a reluctant referee, the way the tension between them flared too fast for a simple cleaning disagreement. I thought about the dishwasher, about how it had turned into a symbol of effort, of blame, of obedience. I thought about the way Mike had looked genuinely startled when I said I drove an hour just to clean. Not guilty, not apologetic, surprised. As if the idea that I'd been making that effort hadn't even crossed his mind. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange, brittle calm. Mike stopped texting me entirely. No reminders, no accusations, no passive-aggressive follow-ups. George was polite when I ran into him, but distant, like someone who didn't want to reopen a door he'd just managed to close. I stayed away as much as possible. When I did go back to the apartment, it was purely transactional. Grab clothes, pick up books, shower, leave. I cleaned up after myself meticulously, wiping down my sink, rinsing the shower walls, making sure no one could accuse me of leaving so much as a fingerprint behind. The kitchen looked different. Fewer dishes in the sink, counters wiped more often, no flies. It made my stomach twist, not with relief, but with irritation. So this was possible all along. I started documenting everything. Screenshots of emails, dates and times I drove in specifically to clean. Notes about interactions, about looks, about tone. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted leverage. I drafted a proposal late one night at my parents' kitchen table, my laptop open beside a mug of tea that had gone cold. Clear, simple, non-negotiable. I would clean up after myself. I would contribute to general cleaning, proportional to the time I actually spent there. I would not be responsible for time-sensitive tasks when I wasn't present. No payments, no penalties, no guilt. If that wasn't acceptable, I would explore moving out and subletting my room, as allowed by the lease. Writing it felt like reclaiming something I hadn't realized I'd handed over. My voice. Still, underneath the resolve, there was unease. Mike's anger during the meeting hadn't just been about fairness. It had been personal, raw, almost misdirected. The way he snapped at George, the way George corrected him like someone who'd done it many times before. I didn't know what their real issue was, but I knew this much. I had been pulled into it without consent. And whatever truth was sitting beneath the surface, it was only a matter of time before it came out, because anger that intense doesn't stay contained forever. I sent the proposal the following week, and the very next day, George knocked on my door. George knocked lightly, like he wasn't sure he was welcome. I opened the door just enough to see his face, already folded into something careful. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. I considered saying no, not because I was afraid, but because I was tired of being reasonable while everyone else unloaded their mess at my feet. Still, I stepped aside. We sat in the living room, the same couch where Mike had accused me of not pulling my weight, the same space that now felt less like common ground and more like neutral territory. George didn't waste time. "I read your proposal," he said, "and you're right." I blinked. That wasn't what I expected. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his palms together like he was organizing his thoughts. "There's context you weren't given," he continued, "and that's on me." He told me then, not dramatically, not like a confession, but like someone finally admitting a long-standing problem. Mike and George had lived together for years before I ever showed up, and for most of that time, Mike had been the messy one. Dishes left out, counters half cleaned, rules ignored until they became arguments. "The rotation," George said, "was my idea. I was trying to force consistency." I felt something cold slide down my spine. "So the system wasn't created for 3 people," I said slowly. "No," he admitted. "It was created for him. And when I moved in, they didn't dismantle it. They expanded it. And suddenly, there was someone else to absorb the tension. Someone quieter, younger, less confrontational. Me." "I should have explained that," George said. "Dragging you into it wasn't fair." I sat back, arms crossed, not defensively, but to anchor myself. "So why did Mike come after me?" I asked. George hesitated. "He's under a lot of stress," he said. "Work, money, feeling like he's constantly being criticized." I let out a short breath. "So instead of dealing with that, he redirected it." George didn't deny it. "He felt like you weren't paying your dues," George added, even if that wasn't logical. There it was again. Logic didn't matter. Control did. George agreed to my proposal, with one adjustment. He asked if I'd be willing to do one deep clean of the common areas once a month, regardless of how often I was home, just to keep things from sliding back into chaos. I thought about it. Once a month wasn't unreasonable, especially if it meant boundaries were finally respected. I'll agree to that, I said, but that's it. He nodded. I'll talk to Mike. 3 days later, Mike texted me. Not angrily, not accusatory. He asked if we could meet for coffee near campus. Every instinct told me to say no, but curiosity won. At the cafe, Mike looked smaller. Not physically, but emotionally. The sharp edges dulled, the certainty gone. He apologized. Not perfectly, not poetically, but sincerely enough. I took my stress out on you, he said. That wasn't fair. He didn't blame work entirely. He didn't deny the emails. He didn't argue semantics. He admitted something else too. That part of his anger came from feeling like he was losing control of the apartment. That my absence made him feel like things were uneven. That instead of dealing with his issues with George directly, it was easier to target the person who wasn't always there to push back. I shouldn't have demanded money, he said quietly. That crossed a line. I told him my boundaries again. He agreed. When I returned to the apartment that evening, the atmosphere was different. Not warm, but stable. Mike and George were sitting at opposite ends of the living room, not arguing, not tense, just existing without friction. The dishwasher was running. The counters were clean. And for the first time since I'd moved in, I didn't feel like I was being watched. Over the following weeks, the issue faded. Texts stopped. Accusations disappeared. The kitchen stayed usable. I held up my end of the agreement. One deep, clean, methodical, and efficient. Not resentful, just deliberate. What struck me most was how obvious it became in hindsight. The mess had never been about dishes. It had been about unresolved conflict, displaced frustration, and the assumption that I, young, quiet, female, would absorb whatever they didn't want to face. But I hadn't, and once I stopped absorbing it, everything shifted. Still, I knew better than to believe that tension evaporates completely. It doesn't vanish. It settles, and sometimes it resurfaces in unexpected ways. Even though the immediate tension with Mike and George had faded, I couldn't shake the lingering weight. Some nights, lying in my small bedroom at my parents' house, I'd feel it press down on my chest like something I couldn't name. Anxiety, frustration, exhaustion, all tangled together. I'd close my eyes and hear echoes of the living room, Mike's accusations, George's sighs, the unspoken tension that had made me feel like an intruder in a place I was legally paying for. It wasn't just physical exhaustion from driving an hour to clean or skipping meals while buried in papers. It was emotional exhaustion, the kind that seeps into your bones when you're constantly anticipating conflict. I started questioning myself. Was I overreacting? Was I being too sensitive? Was it really that bad? I knew it was bad, but knowing logically and feeling it are two separate things. And the feeling? It was heavy. For the first time since I moved in, I wondered if maybe I should just give in. Comply. Drive, clean, submit, stay invisible. But the memory of Mike's email, demanding money for not cleaning their mess, refused to leave me. It gnawed at me. I had been treated unfairly, and no one was apologizing for it. I replayed the arguments over and over, the way he had turned my absence into guilt, the way he assumed my intentions, the way George tried to mediate, yet left the responsibility squarely on me. I felt cornered and alone. Even Ethan couldn't fix this. He could only witness it, offer calm words, and remind me that I wasn't crazy. But he couldn't step into the apartment in my place. He couldn't defend me in the face of their entitled accusations. I thought about leaving, moving out, finding a studio closer to campus, closer to peace. But that meant breaking the lease, losing the money I'd invested, dealing with landlords. And somehow I felt like I shouldn't have to run away. My mind drifted to the worst-case scenarios. What if I stayed and the tension escalated again? What if Mike found another way to make me feel wrong, even with George moderating? What if my quiet, responsible presence was always going to be interpreted as laziness, incompetence, or disrespect? I felt small, minimized, dismissed, and that realization hit me harder than any argument. All of this for doing the bare minimum I could control. The apartment, my own sanctuary in theory, had become a psychological minefield. Every creaking floorboard, every clatter of dishes, every glance that lingered too long felt like a test I hadn't signed up for. It was the point where I questioned more than chores. I questioned my judgment, my boundaries, my worth. I cried once that night, silently, curled under my blanket. Not from sadness exactly, but from the frustration of realizing that people can project their anger and insecurities onto you, and no matter how careful, how reasonable, how accommodating you are, you're still on the receiving end. But somewhere in that dark, exhausted place, a spark remained. I remembered why I had moved in: independence, survival, quiet control over my own life. I remembered Ethan's words: "You're not crazy. You're reasonable. You have every right to protect yourself." I thought of my proposal sitting in my drafts folder, clear and uncompromising. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the beginnings of something else: determination. Because even in that dark moment, alone, exhausted, overwhelmed, I realized I wasn't going to let them dictate my life. Not this time. The turning point came quietly, almost imperceptibly. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I had stopped by the apartment to grab a textbook I'd forgotten. I expected tension in the air, stiff nods, maybe even passive-aggressive sighs. Instead, I found George sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, and Mike at the kitchen counter, quietly cleaning up after himself. No raised voices, no accusations, no smirks, no subtle glares. Something had shifted. George looked up and smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "Hey," he said, "got a minute?" I hesitated, remembering the last conversation, the house meeting, the long hours of driving, the silent frustration. "I do," I said cautiously. He motioned for me to sit across from him. He exhaled slowly. "Look," he began, "I owe you an explanation and an apology, not just for dragging you into our issues, but for letting it get this far." I stayed silent, letting him continue. George explained that the conflicts between him and Mike weren't new. They had been roommates for years, yes, but there were layers I hadn't seen. Small irritations built into long-standing resentments. Minor arguments about dishes or cleaning escalated over time. And when I moved in, I had unknowingly become the buffer, or the lightning rod, someone who could absorb tension that otherwise would have been between them. He paused, looking down at his hands. "I should have told you everything from the start, that the rotation existed to manage Mike's habits, that it wasn't meant to trap you. You got caught in the middle, and that wasn't fair." For the first time, I felt clarity. The weight of weeks, months really, began to lift. The frustration, the self-doubt, the nagging anxiety, it all had context now. It wasn't personal. It wasn't my fault. "And Mike?" I asked quietly. George hesitated. "He's under a lot of pressure. Work stress, personal stuff, feeling like he's constantly failing. He projected it onto you." I let that settle. I realized that all the anger, all the accusations, all the passive-aggressive texts, they weren't about me. They were about their unresolved issues. I had been in the crossfire, and the crossfire was never mine to carry. George then asked if I would reconsider the proposal I had sent, a compromise where I clean up after myself, contribute proportionally, and do one deep clean of common areas monthly. I nodded. I was firm. That was fair. That was all I would do. A few days later, Mike reached out. He wanted to meet at a coffee shop near campus. My heart thumped with a mix of dread and curiosity. When I arrived, Mike was already there, looking smaller, less sharp, more human. He apologized, not formally, not theatrically, just plainly. "I've been unfair," he said. "I've taken my frustration out on you. I shouldn't have demanded money. I shouldn't have assumed you weren't contributing." He paused, and then, almost reluctantly, shared something that stunned me. Mike and George weren't just roommates. They had a complicated personal dynamic, an intertwined relationship that had been under strain for years. Part of the tension I witnessed, part of the arguments, part of Mike's anger toward me had been projection from his own insecurities. He admitted that seeing George being friendly with me triggered jealousy, even though it had nothing to do with me. I sat back, absorbing this. The realization hit hard. All those weeks of tension, all that emotional labor, had not been about my behavior at all. I had been caught in a storm I didn't create. I listened, I acknowledged, I reinforced my boundaries. I did not apologize for standing my ground, and he did not press. When I left that coffee shop, I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time, I saw the path forward clearly. The crossfire had ended. The tension had a name, a source, and it was no longer mine to carry. And in that clarity, I found strength. Returning to the apartment that evening felt different. Not warm, not celebratory, not cozy, but it felt safe. Mike and George were sitting together in the living room, something I had rarely noticed before. They greeted me politely, nodded as I walked past, and neither tried to pull me into arguments or discussions about chores. The kitchen was tidy. The counters were clear. The dishwasher ran only when full. And for the first time, I didn't feel like an intruder. Over the following days, a pattern settled. Mike cleaned after himself. George continued to maintain the balance he had promised. The rotation was officially over. The house rules I had been forced to navigate for months became irrelevant. My deep cleaning once a month was the only obligation outside of taking care of myself. Simple, fair, manageable. The shift had unexpected ripple effects. Mike and George started communicating better, not just about chores, but about their own issues. Subtle gestures I had missed before became clear. Casual touches, glances, inside jokes. The tension I had interpreted as anger toward me was actually about their internal struggles. And by stepping out of their crossfire, I had inadvertently given them space to confront each other. It was strange to watch them. Their arguments hadn't disappeared entirely, but the target had changed. It was no longer me. And that simple shift made the apartment livable again. I noticed a change in myself, too. For months, I had felt small, frustrated, anxious. I questioned my worth and my judgment. But now I realized how much strength it took just to stand firm, to advocate for myself, and to protect my boundaries. I had learned that fairness isn't always equal, that independence sometimes requires confrontation, and that patience, clarity, and boundaries can disarm situations that seem hopeless. When the lease ended 3 months later, I moved into a studio apartment near campus. I had already saved enough to make the transition smooth, and I finally felt the sense of ownership and control I had sought from the start. The apartment was mine. My routines were mine. My space was mine. Mike and George were cordial during the move. They helped carry a few boxes, offered polite goodbyes, and even sent a small plant with a note wishing me well. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a quiet recognition of the conflict and resolution we had navigated together. I smiled and placed it on my windowsill, a small reminder of lessons learned. Over time, I reflected on the entire experience. The roommates from hell weren't evil. They were human, flawed, and complicated. Their conflicts weren't caused by me, yet I had been caught in the middle. By standing my ground, documenting everything, and asserting my boundaries, I forced clarity, fairness, and respect into a situation that initially seemed uncontrollable. I walked away with more than just a clean slate for my living space. I walked away with confidence, resilience, and the knowledge that I didn't have to absorb other people's chaos to survive. And while I never became friends with Mike or George, I realized something profound. Sometimes the best resolution isn't revenge. It's simply stepping out of the crossfire and letting people face their own issues while you remain unscathed. I never received another text about unpaid chores. I never felt threatened again. The apartment became just a place to live, a place to exist without fear, without guilt, without projection. And for me, that was enough. Living alone in my new studio apartment was liberating. No judgments, no hidden expectations, no silent accusations, just walls that belonged entirely to me and a bathroom I could lock without guilt. The peace I had longed for had finally arrived, not because the conflict disappeared entirely, but because I claimed my space, my boundaries, and my voice. I reflected on everything that had happened. The anger, the manipulation, the unfair expectations. They weren't my responsibility, yet navigating them had taught me invaluable lessons. I learned the power of assertion. Standing up for myself wasn't about confrontation. It was about clarity, fairness, and self-respect. By documenting everything, communicating firmly, and refusing to be the buffer for unresolved conflicts, I reclaimed control over my own life. I learned the importance of observation and patience. Things that initially seemed like personal attacks, Mike's accusations, the tension in the apartment, turned out to be projections of others' insecurities. By stepping back, I saw the real issues and addressed them strategically, rather than reacting impulsively. I learned that peace often requires boundaries, not avoidance. Moving out wasn't just about escaping discomfort, it was about creating an environment where I could thrive. Protecting myself didn't make me selfish, it made me strong. And most importantly, I learned that difficult situations can catalyze growth. The stress, frustration, and tension forced me to recognize my own strength, communicate with clarity, and enforce limits I might have otherwise avoided. What had started as a nightmare became a lesson in resilience. The plant Mike and George sent me sits on my windowsill, thriving in the sunlight. I often glance at it and smile. It's a simple reminder that even messy, complicated, frustrating experiences can result in something positive: growth, clarity, and peace. Unexpected outcomes born from standing firm, observing carefully, and not letting someone else's chaos define your life. I finally understand. You don't need to absorb the storms of others. You don't need to fight every battle, pay for everyone else's mistakes, or justify your every action. Sometimes the strongest choice is to stand your ground, claim your space, and let the consequences of others' actions unfold without you carrying the weight. I am living proof that even in situations that feel unbearable, there is a way forward, calm, fair, and unshaken. And that is enough.